One of the most common questions that I hear is, how much do I need to retire? And what many people are really asking is, do I actually have enough to stop working without worrying every time the market moves? Because $1 million can feel very comfortable for one person and it can feel very tight for another. And it's not because one did something right and the other did something wrong, but because their spending and income and timing all look different. So instead of starting with a number, I want to slow this down and talk about what actually determines how long your money lasts in retirement and where I see people get tripped up when they don't think about it in this way. So, if we haven't met, I'm Ryan Kravitz. I work with retirees and people getting close to retirement and helping them turn what they've saved into income that they can actually feel confident about. I want to be very clear about what this video is. This isn't about finding the perfect number, and it's not about chasing the right strategy. It's about understanding the few things that really drive the outcome so that retirement feels more predictable and less stressful. So here's where I see people get stuck. Most people don't really know how much they can safely spend from their savings. And they'll say things like, where do we even start? Or how do we know if we're okay? Or we just don't want to mess this up. And sometimes, not always, someone will mention the 4% rule and they'll ask, you know, does this apply to us? Is this something we should be using? And my response is usually something like, well, maybe, but by itself, that doesn't really answer the question that you're asking because those kinds of rules assume that retirement is just simple and predictable. But real life isn't. Income changes, expenses change, priorities change. You might retire before Social Security starts. So early on, you're actually pulling more from savings, and then later on, you're not. Or maybe a pension starts later. Or maybe there's money coming in down the road that changes things. Maybe you already know that you'll spend money earlier on and that you're going to spend less later. I mean, all of that matters. So instead of asking, what percentage can I take every year? A better question is, what does our cash flow need to look like at different points in time in retirement? Because timing changes everything. Now, when we're talking about retirement, the timeline really matters because once you stop work, you don't get a do-over on the early years. So, we have to think about this. Are we planning for 15 years? Are we thinking retirement might be 25 years, might be 35 years? I mean, certainly this is the big unknown, but we want to do our best guesstimate of what we think this looks like. Because a couple that retires in their early 60s has a very good chance of one of them living into their 90s. And once you really let that sink in, the question changes. It's no longer, okay, how long will this money last? It kind of shifts. It kind of becomes, okay, well, can this plan support us for as long as we're here, even as things change along the way? And that shift matters because it affects how every decision gets made. So let me give you an example that sounds like a lot of the meetings that I have. So a couple sits down with me either in my office or via Zoom and says, hey, we don't live an extravagant lifestyle. We just want to make sure that we're going to be okay. And they might have saved a little over $1 million. And when I ask what they really think that they'll spend in retirement, there's usually a pause. And then they'll say something like, we're not really sure. We know what our bills are. We know what we spend month to month right now. We just don't know what's realistic once we stop working. And that's a very normal place to be. They're not trying to optimize anything. They're not trying to squeeze every dollar out of their plan. They just want to know whether the life that they have in mind is actually supported by what they have saved. So instead of jumping straight into the math, we back up. We talk through fixed expenses. We talk about what the early years of retirement might look like versus later on. We talk about when different income sources start and what that changes. And we talk about costs that tend to creep in gradually over time. Once we do that, the picture usually becomes much clearer. Not worse, just clearer. And clarity is what everything else is built on. Now, once we frame the problem correctly, so to speak, and the problem being spending, and I don't mean this in a judgmental way, it's just in an honest way, because most retirees don't overspend because they're being careless. Oftentimes they overspend because they just don't realize what's missing. And most people know their bills. They know what they spend while they're working. What's harder is retirement spending because it doesn't stay the same. Early in retirement, spending often goes up. You travel while you're healthy. You replace a car, or you tackle projects around the house. Maybe that new kitchen that you've finally been wanting to get. Whatever it is. Maybe it's you want to help a child or a grandchild. I mean, and all these things, they're not irresponsible. These things are normal. But what matters is recognizing that retirement spending usually comes in phases. So higher early on, more stable for a while, and then later costs often tend to rise again, usually related to health. So a plan that assumes the same spending every year can look fine and still be fragile. A more realistic way to think about it is, what do the first few years look like? And then what does that settle into? Because if the early years are heavier, the next part becomes especially important. So market downturns are frustrating when you're working. Early in retirement, that they're a much bigger deal because you're not just watching balances move around, you're also taking money out. And if you retire with $1 million and the market drops early on, the issue isn't just the drop, it's that you're pulling income at the same time. And then that combination can change how long the money lasts, even if the market recovers later on. And this is why two people can start in similar places and end up in very different situations, not because one picked better investments, but because the timing worked differently. So what matters most here isn't being right about the market. It's having a plan that can get through a rough stretch while you're taking income. And that usually comes down to very practical things, where the money comes from, how much cash you have set aside, how flexible you can be without feeling like you're constantly reacting. And this is also where steady income really starts to matter. And this is why I don't think about Social Security as something that you just add on later. The timing affects how much pressure you're putting on your savings, how long your portfolio has to carry you, and how flexible the rest of the plan can be. Even a 1 or a 2 year difference can change how much stress the portfolio is under earlier on. And when Social Security is coordinated with everything else, especially early on, it often becomes the piece that helps the whole plan feel more stable. It's not about one decision in and of itself. It's about how everything works together. Now, another area that people tend to underestimate is taxes. A lot of people assume taxes will automatically be lower in retirement. And sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. It depends on where your money is and how income shows up over time. And here's what surprises people. I mean, you can create a tax issue without feeling like you're spending more. Two people can live very similar lifestyles, but depending on where their money comes from, the after tax result can look very different. And taxes don't just affect taxes. I mean, they can quietly reduce flexibility later on. And that's why in retirement, this usually comes down to timing and coordination. Now, healthcare is another area that often catches people off guard. I mean, before Medicare, coverage can be expensive. Now, there could be some exceptions here. You qualify for ACA subsidies and things like that. But nevertheless, it could be expensive depending on where you fall, what kind of plan you have, and all that. Now, after Medicare, premiums can still change. Now, one important thing to understand is that Medicare premiums aren't based on what you're earning today. They're based on what your income looked like a couple years earlier. So a decision that you make now, like taking extra income or selling something or moving money around, any of these things could show up later as higher premiums when it no longer feels connected. And this isn't about avoiding decisions, and it's really just about understanding the ripple effect so that nothing comes as a surprise down the line. So by now you could probably see, I mean, there's no single right answer to, how long $1 million lasts. I mean, it lasts until withdrawals put too much pressure on the plan, especially during the wrong stretch of time. And when we look at real retirements, a range usually shows up. So if someone leans heavily on savings early on and the timing is rough, the money can erode faster than expected. Now, on the other hand, when income sources are coordinated and taxes are handled thoughtfully, and there's flexibility along the way, that same $1 million can last a very long time. The difference isn't luck. It's just in how well everything works together. So instead of asking, is $1 million enough? A better question might be, what would have to be true for this to work? And what would cause problems if things didn't go as planned? If this is something you're thinking about, I mean, the goal isn't to figure it out on your own. The goal is to sit down and actually walk through, how all these different pieces fit together with your spending and your income and your taxes and how the plan holds up when things don't go perfectly. And that's the work that I do with people every day. And that's really where real clarity usually comes from. $1 million is certainly a solid starting point for retirement. But whether it lasts has much less to do with hitting the right number and much more to do with making sure that the pieces really work together in real life. If this is something that you're thinking about, there's a link below where you can learn more about how I help people work through these exact same types of questions. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.